Well, today's video is a little bit longer than usual, but what I'm talking about is so central to what I'm trying to achieve here with this series of videos that I felt like I needed to go a little more in depth. So bear with me. Anglican theology has developed along a different path from that of the Reformed Church, influenced by John Calvin. But because Reformed theology is widespread in the United States, many people are unwittingly influenced about it, including Episcopalians like myself. This is perhaps most apparent in their understanding of the statement, Christ died for us. Reformed theology sees Christ's death as a form of payment. Thus, for them, Christ's suffering was a necessary and integral part of salvation. The questions remain, however, how can it be that there was only one avenue through which God, the omnipotent creator of all, could save us? And how can we reconcile the God that is love with the understanding that cruelty was necessary for salvation? In contrast with Reformed theology, I believe that Christ's crucifixion was inevitable, but not necessary. Educational, but not a substitution for the suffering of others. The interpretation of the crucifixion as necessary has contributed to an unfortunate belief that I have to hurt to help. If it was necessary even for God, the Almighty, to torture and kill on the cross in order to save humanity, then are our own violent and abusive methods not also justified as necessarily unpleasant means to a virtuous end? Cruelty thus creeps in through the back door. People have even killed in the name of Christ. But is that so surprising when a common interpretation of salvation history is that God created Jesus not so that he could teach us, but so that he could be tortured to death? The Crusades, the Inquisition, witch hunts, the abuses of native populations in the Americas by missionaries all assumed I have to hurt to help. If suffering were integral to salvation, moreover, it would be a short step towards the notion that the more Christ suffered, the greater our salvation, an underlying assumption of Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ. Suffering, passion, is even in the title. I'm reminded of the austere minister in Ingmar Bergman's film, Fanny and Alexander, who claims that God's love is harsh as he tortures the children and his new wife. Eventually, the siblings are rescued and restored to the elegant, loving, imaginative home of their grandmother by Jews. So salvation comes once again through the Hebrews. But young Alexander's imagination in particular has been twisted by the experience with his stepfather. You might want to watch this film. Another baleful outcome of the assumption that salvation requires suffering is that alleviating the suffering of others becomes not my problem. We think people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Ironically, a phrase that originally referred to the impossibility of just such an act. Historically, austerity measures during economic contractions have made the situation worse, but people still insist on them because they accord with the sense that salvation comes through suffering. That is, we must pay for our sins, not through grace and generosity. This assumption leads, in other words, to a hardness of the heart. People will argue that focusing on the cruelty of the crucifixion is to misunderstand the Trinity, to fail to grasp that it was God, God's self, who suffered. History indicates, however, that an orthodox understanding of the Trinity has done little to prevent people from believing that cruelty is sometimes necessary to bring about sanctification. Focusing on this aspect, moreover, has had its own pernicious outcomes. It has encouraged self-mortification, seeking growth through self-imposed suffering, fake suffering in a way. I've observed nothing of importance derived from such a practice. Self-imposed misery is more likely to produce sanctimony, than sanctification. Phony suffering produces phony results. In other words, adversity often leads to growth in ourselves, but imposing adversity on ourselves or on others is hypocritical and produces hypocritical results. One need not go looking for adversity as an opportunity for growth. It will find one. If the crucifixion was the only way God could secure salvation, then God is remarkably limited. In Christian arguments against utilitarianism, the philosophy that the ends justify the means, are on shaky ground. Surely God sent Christ. God came into the world as Christ to teach us to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves, despite its being inevitable that that message would lead to his execution, given the reality that most humans do not understand that love wins in the end. The Gospels depict Christ, towards the end of his ministry at least, as well aware that he is to be killed. But he loves us so much that he refuses to abandon his mission by fleeing to India or capitulating to the demands of the religious elite. Christ certainly died because of our sins, but not as some sort of necessary payment. He exemplifies love without ceasing. As John explains, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. An all-powerful God who is love does not have to torture to save, but may accept the inevitability of torture in order to help others to grow. This is the same attitude that we find in those noble women and men throughout history who have sacrificed themselves for the well-being of the whole. Now, I don't know whether the earthly scales will ever tip in the direction of understanding that love wins, or whether those people who have grasped this truth go on to heaven and make room for more misguided people to come here for instruction and experience, thus preventing the balance from shifting. Whatever the case, I know that the universe is working out as God planned it, and love will triumph. In the meantime, it's important to realize that the sense that the crucifixion was necessary rather than inevitable has justified cruelty. As worshippers of the one holy and omnipotent God, who is love, we must consider well how we represent God, who is never manipulative, never cruel, always gracious, loving, and requires the same of us.